welcome to my channel. So it's a very busy week and a busy moment for Africa. There's a lot happening. There are coups, the African Climate Summit, and much more. So I'll talk about the great African leadership divide that has been witnessed or exposed during the African Climate Summit. This means there's a divide among African leaders on which way to go, which way Africa should go to, or which path Africa should pursue in its goal of economic development. So there's a divide among African leaders. And this divide was exposed at the African Climate Summit, which was held in Nairobi this past week. And many leaders from the world attended. And significantly, the big heavyweights of Africa, the African leaders of South Africa, Nigeria, heavyweights, even Egypt, it's like they skipped the Africa Climate Summit. Even Museveni of Uganda, they skipped it. Yet you see, climate is a very important thing in Africa and even the world, and climate change is a very big issue. So the question is, why did they skip this important summit? So their skipping of this summit actually exposed or showcased the divide among African leaders. So the summit was hosted by William Ruto, the Kenyan president, and many other African leaders attended, like Sassou Nguesso, Afewerki, and others attended. But the heavyweights, South Africa, Nigeria, skipped the meeting. So it's like there's a divide. Even the cool leaders of Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Gabon, all of them, they skipped. Even Guinea, they skipped this meeting. Even Algeria, all of them. So there's a divide happening. There's a divide going on in Africa. And we can see that leaders are having different mentalities about how Africa can develop. Of course, they all love Africa. I think they all have the best interests for our continent, but they only have different ideals or methodologies of how to achieve this economic development. So we shall look at this divide. So this is the East African newspaper, which is a very important paper in East Africa, published by the Nation Media Group. So the headline is why Uganda, South Africa, and Nigeria leaders skipped the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi. So here we shall see the details that show why there's a divide. So when 14 African presidents came to Nairobi this week for the first Africa Climate Summit, Uganda's President Museveni did not show up. The same with South Africa's Ramaphosa and Nigeria's Tinubu. But why? So the Nation newspaper and the East Africa learned from 3 senior Kenyan ministry officials that Uganda's Museveni wrote to Kenya declining the invitation, stating categorically that he could not sit and be lectured by US climate envoy John Kerry, who hails from a global north country that's among the world's biggest polluters. That's what Museveni said, categorically, that he cannot come to this summit, that's Museveni, to sit down and be lectured by the US climate envoy John Kerry. Of course, John Kerry was a big speaker in this climate summit, and of course he gave lectures as usual. So he could not sit and be lectured by the US climate envoy John Kerry, who comes from the global north country, that is US. That's among the world's biggest polluters. As you may know, so this story continues. Not all countries are equally responsible for the climate crisis. According to the World Meteorological Organization, more than 30 gigatons of carbon dioxide are released into the Earth's atmosphere each year. This is the main source of greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. And most of these gases come from the use of fossil fuels and other energy production and other polluting human activities. The top 10 polluters include China, that releases 10,065 million tons of CO2. Then number 2 is US, that emits 5,416 million tons. The third is India with 2,654 million tons. Russia, 1,711 million tons. Japan, 1,162 million tons. Germany, 759 million tons. And then Iran, 720 million tons. South Korea, 659 million tons. Saudi Arabia, 621 million tons. And Indonesia, 615 million tons. These are the top 10. China, US, India, Russia, Japan, Germany, Iran, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia. So Indonesia releases 615 million tons. While Africa, the entire Africa continent, accounts for only 4% of global carbon emissions, despite being the continent suffering most from the climate crisis. So, Museveni's reason for not attending this summit also exposes the hypocrisy of the climate change debate, whereby the biggest polluters are not doing anything about it, but only giving lectures. That's why Museveni chose not to attend this summit. But analytically, it also shows that there's a divide in Africa, that African leaders are tired of being lectured. They're tired of following the mandates of the West. They are tired of following the guidelines of the West. Because according to Museveni and most African leaders, it is the West and the global North who are responsible for the climate change. So here in this case, it seems like countries like Kenya, who are obedient, with them they prefer to follow the West guideline. Countries like Kenya, among others, that were in this summit, they prefer to follow the West's guideline. But now we have other radical countries like Uganda that know that there is hypocrisy. And these radical countries, they want some change. They want Africa to look for solutions, not to wait for solutions to come from the West or the North, but they want Africa to look for African solutions. So that's the divide happening in Africa. That's why even those cool leaders like Niger, Gabon, Mali, Burkina Faso, they did not show up in this climate summit. The same with the BRICS top leaders like South Africa, Nigeria, etc. Never showed up. That's a group of the radical nations who view that Africa is grown up enough and can come up with its own solutions. And even things like minerals, it's high time Africa stop exporting raw materials and instead process the minerals and sell the processed products so as to get enough value for their money. So there's a divide in Africa. Countries like Kenya, among others, still prefer to appeal to the West to help Africa. But now we have radical countries like Uganda, South Africa, which are defiant. They want to look for other options, but all of them, they have one view, that Africa economic development is important, but they only have different methodologies of achieving it. So let's look at this divide. So we have always leaders, some are radicals in ideology, and some are moderate. So you have radical African leaders who want a complete change in Africa's economic policies to make Africa independent from the Western financial system. And then you have the moderates who want to be incorporated in the Western system. So with them, they want a gradual change. Radical want a quick change, but moderates want a quick change. The moderates want a slow change, which is gradual. So example of radicals are those leaders like Ramaphosa, who are calling for Africa to stop exporting raw materials. So here we have Ramaphosa, who was in the BRICS meeting, and even the cool leaders, like the leaders of Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, all of them. Those are the radicals. They want Africa radical transformation. But moderates are those who want to be incorporated in the Western economic system. They want to be invited to the negotiation table. They want to negotiate with the World Bank and IMF. These are the people like William Ruto of Kenya, Sassou Nguesso, Ghana president, Nana Akufo, Ivory Coast president. These are the moderates. They want to be part of the Western economic system. But the radicals want a complete shift. Radicals want a complete shift in economic development. Moderates want to be invited to the table, but radicals want to make their own table. So most of the radicals skipped the meeting, the climate summit meeting. But some of them attended. Like the Eritrean president of Afwerki attended. He's a radical, but he attended. And he gave his peace of mind. But most moderates attended. Of course, some skipped. Like even Tinubu of Nigeria is a moderate, but he skipped, I think, because he was busy with the ECOWAS issue and Niger issue. So the group of radicals want a complete shift. The key element of radicals, they want Africa to stop exporting raw materials. So both Ramaphosa and Museveni have been adamant on this. Museveni wants Africa to stop exporting raw coffee, but to process it into finished Nescafe. Ramaphosa wants Africa to stop exporting raw minerals, like raw gold, but to process them. These are radicals. And they all skip that meeting, the climate meeting. So at the BRICS Summit, Ramaphosa called for African countries to stop exporting raw minerals. But any processing company, whether they are foreign or local, to process those minerals in Africa and then export finished products. The same with the Guinea leader, Colonel Damboya, who calls for no more exporting of raw gold from Guinea, but they should be processed in the country. These are the radicals. They're the radical leaders, and they skip that meeting. Others are the Niger leader, Burkina Faso leader, Mali leader, all of them. These are radicals. Like the Niger leader, he has raised the price of uranium from 0.8 cents to 200 euros per kilogram. This is the effort of making Africa to benefit from their own resources. These are radical view. Even leaders of Mali, Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore, these are all radicals. They want Africa to be independent, to stop being exploited. And they want this to happen immediately. And they're implementing these policies right now. That's why they are the loggerheads with the West. These are the radicals. So Africa has always had radicals. Like Gaddafi was a radical. Lumumba of Congo was a radical. But then even Nkrumah was a radical, because Nkrumah wanted Africa to be united. But then we always have moderates also. So Eritrea leader Afwerki also is a radical, but he attended the climate summit. And he gave his point of view at that summit. He said that to deal with the summit, the biggest polluters, those who are in the global north, should take responsibility. And they should involve the African governments instead of using the foreign NGOs to push the agenda. If money is to be released, it should be given to African governments and local NGOs, not foreign NGOs. So he called out the Western hypocrisy over this climate summit operations. So Museveni also rejected the IMF and World Bank conditions. So he's a radical. So these radicals, they call for Africa to be independent. Instead of begging for development aid, Africa should look for other alternatives. And BRICS provides Africa with other options. So the African radical leaders, they want to look at BRICS and the World Bank as options. So BRICS has the BRICS Development Bank, which is a rival of World Bank and IMF. So radicals view that the world has changed. The world is no longer unilateral, but the world is multilateral with different options of lending and borrowing. So radicals want quick change, quick transformation, but moderates want gradual change, more inclusive, and they want the world to be still governed by the Western system, but that Africa should be given a better bargaining power. So the Africa Climate Summit was held in Africa, in Nairobi, whereby Africa was supposed to have its own voice on the climate issue. But the radicals kept the event because they knew that the NGOs from the West will command or will dominate the discussions, and Africa will not be allowed to air its voice because Africa is the least polluter. And this is true. At the summit, the NGOs and the West, their voice was more dominant. And even the final outcome, the final paper that they read, the conclusion, was not very radical. It was just purely moderate. So the moderates are like Kenya's President William Ruto. So guys like John Kerry, who is a US envoy, was in that summit, and he aired the West's position on this, the West agenda. So the radicals keep this event because they didn't want to be lectured by the West, people like John Kerry. So Ruto is a presumed leader of the moderates. Moderates want to bargain with the World Bank, with the IMF, to give Africa better lending conditions. But the radicals want to look for other options, not just focus on World Bank and IMF. That's why the radicals want to look at both BRICS, among others. So Ruto is more moderate. The same with Ghana's president, and even Nigeria's leader Tinubu and others. These are the moderates who want a slow, gradual process of transformation. So even at the Africa Climate Summit, Ruto called for more inclusivity of Africa. But the radicals' view is that the West should pay because they're the biggest polluters. And they should leave Africa out of this. In fact, they should give Africa compensation. But moderates like Ruto want Africa to be included. So them they are more moderate in their thinking. Even in the 1980s, Kenya's then President Moi was the leader of the moderates. I think we shall look at this in another episode. How Kenya's leader Moi in the 1980s was used to tame the then radical Gaddafi from assuming the chair of OAU, which was the AU then. I don't know which year it was. I shall look at this later. How the West backed Moi and other leaders to extend Moi's term as chairman of OAU and to deny Gaddafi the chance to be chair. So even then, there was that division. Moi was leader of the moderates and Gaddafi was the leader of the radicals. So Kenya has always been like a puppet of the West and used to tame other radicals in the continent since Moi's days. And even Ruto now is pursuing the same footsteps which Moi followed, moderates. And they're all being used by the West to frustrate other leaders who are radicals. So you can recall even Ruto joined hands with Tinubu to condemn the Niger coup, and even the others like Sudan. So he's playing the same role Moi used to play in the 80s. So even Moi was a moderate. That's the situation. I think I shall discuss more about this 1980 event where Moi was used to to curtail Gaddafi. Gaddafi was a radical. But that's a story for another day. But today, Ruto is a presumed leader of the moderates. So there's been a disappointment among many people in Africa and even Kenya with the result of this climate summit, which was held in Nairobi. People expected a lot because people now know that Africa is the least polluter. So there were protests. Of course, the end result was the summit proposed a global tax. But Africa is supposed to be compensated. That's a radical option. Because Africa is the least polluter, but Africa is bearing the brunt of most of the suffering, the climate suffering, the climate weather. Africa is bearing the brunt, hunger, famine. So instead of calling for compensation, even cancelling of the loans from World Bank to African countries, because we're carrying the burden of these Western countries, so they should give us the relief, cancel even our loans. But instead, the climate summit came up with the conclusion of a global tax, which is more moderate. So in other words, radicals like Museveni who skip this event, they have been proven right. Their fears have been proven right. So that's where Africa is today. We have radicals and we have moderates. ECOWAS is being led by radicals. Like Tinubu of Nigeria is a radical. No, ECOWAS is being led by the moderates. Like Tinubu of Nigeria is a moderate who is the chair of ECOWAS. Nana Akufo of Ghana is also a moderate. They're the ones who are sanctioning Niger. And then Niger leader, Mali leader, Guinea leader, Burkina Faso, these are all radicals, together with Museveni and Ramaphosa and others. So that's the ideological difference between African leaders. It was exposed at the African Climate Summit. For me, I'm not saying that any of them is bad. It's only bad when some leaders are being used by the West to frustrate other leaders. But these leaders, ideologically, they only have different methodologies of Africa's development. So that's the divide in Africa. So I think next time I shall look at how some of these divides in the 1980s and even the days of Nkrumah, because Nkrumah of Ghana, he was a radical. He wanted Africa to be united in the 1960s. But we had moderates who wanted Africa to be independent, autonomous countries. So this divide began a long time ago. And the West has always controlled the moderates. And Russia has always been on the side of radicals. That's how it has always been in Africa, and that's how it is even today. So that's my discussion for today. I don't know what to think, but let me see your comment in the comment section. And thank you very much.